Welcome back to another video lecture for AP World History. Today, we're going to be talking about how communism developed in Russia, in China, and in the developing world, and why it's important. Communism has a really complicated history. Karl Marx believed that communism was going to take off in industrialized countries in Europe because of what was going on with capitalism and industrialization. Didn't really happen that way. In fact, communism ended up taking off in agricultural countries, especially with traditional father figure leaders, places like Russia and China, Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. The real question that came up for a lot of communist leaders was, why was this happening? And I'm going to make the argument here that it wasn't because the proletariat or the workers of the world were rising up, but rather because farmers rose up, and they rose up in really difficult situations, especially war crises like World War I and World War II, in order to deal with the problems of inequalities. Okay, let's start off with Russia. When we get to World War I in Russia, there was a revolution against the Tsar in 1919 because the Russians were losing the war and farmers were suffering from inequalities, from famine, and just from really poor management of what was happening at the time period. Then there was a transitional government, actually, that was set up that was socialist at the time period. But one of the communist leaders, I.V. Lenin, was not happy with how slow things were going. So he led a revolution, a Soviet revolution, that was based upon his idea called the Intellectual Vanguard. The Intellectual Vanguard were a group of communist leaders who he believed would instruct the peasants to rise up and create a communist country. And that's what happened. The communists took over and they were able to fight not only against the Tsar, but also against, at that time period, the transitional government. Lenin created a communist government that was meant to transition the Soviet Union into communism. It didn't work out so well for him for a while, so he created something called the New Economic Plan. In the New Economic Plan, he believed that there could be a short period of private ownership of property and competition that would eventually lead into communism. Then I.V. Lenin fell ill and he died of illnesses at the time. And so he chose Joseph Stalin to be the next leader. Now, it's a little complicated. In fact, right before his death, I.V. Lenin realized what a mistake this choice was going to be. And he was right. Joseph Stalin was a traditional sort of Russian father figure leader. And he did what a lot of leaders did at that time period. He made allies with people in order to turn on his enemies. And then he would make enemies of the people that originally were his allies. Give an example. There was a guy named Leon Trotsky, and Trotsky came up with an idea called collectivization. Trotsky believed that the best way for the Soviet Union forward was for farmers to work together. And if they worked together to produce crops, the government could tax them and then use that to build up industry and make Russia strong. Well, Joseph Stalin claimed Trotsky was a traitor to the revolution and kicked him out of the country. In fact, in the 1950s, he had his KGB track him down and kill him with an ice pick to his head. Now, as soon as Trotsky was out of the country, Joseph Stalin then turned on his allies, a man named Bukharin, who had come up with the idea of cooperatives. The idea of cooperatives was to have farmers work together, but at a slower rate tax them and a slower rate do industrialization. Joseph Stalin said, hey, I came up with this great idea called collectivization. It was my idea. And he ended up imprisoning Bukharin and all of his followers. And that's basically what Joseph Stalin would do. Now, he eventually seized power in Russia, and he instituted his 5-year plans based upon collectivization, the idea of having the farmers work together, taxing them, and then building up industry. He was actually really successful. He ended up creating massive industrialization in Russia, but he did it by creating mass killings of people in Russia. I'll give you an example. There were a group of people in the Ukraine called the kulaks. The kulaks were middle-class farmers, and they resisted against Joseph Stalin. So what did Stalin do? In the dead of winter, he had his KGB go in and take all of their crops and then blockade them. Now, it's so cold in the Ukraine that the people there starved and had nothing left. By the time Joseph Stalin was done, he killed over 20 million people, but he was able to industrialize Russia. So I guess, success, not so much. Anyways, that was Russia. What about China? China was similar in many ways. The leader there was Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen had taken over after the Qing dynasty fell apart. He had 2 students, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao. Chiang Kai-shek turned towards the West. Mao turned towards communism. Chiang Kai-shek went after Mao and his followers and brutally attacked them, trying to massacre them. So Mao went to the countryside, and there he made allies with the peasants, and during World War II protected them against the Japanese imperialists. At the end of World War II, the peasants followed Mao, and he was able to rebel and kick Chiang Kai-shek out of the country. Chiang Kai-shek ended up in Taiwan, what would eventually become known as sort of the second China. Well, at that point, Mao decided to do something called the Great Leap Forward. Now, he wanted to maintain overall traditional Chinese farming, but he wanted to move China more towards industrialization. So he did this thing called the Great Leap Forward, where he had 10,000 farmers who would be placed on common land. His idea was they would make crops together, he would tax them, build up industrialization. Didn't work out so well. In fact, it caused massive disillusionment amongst the farmers because their land was so sacred to them. And it also caused incredible disorganization. By the time it was done, Mao created a mass famine in the country. Now, typically, when you have such a huge failure, a leader like that is assassinated. He's taken out of power. But Mao did something rather brilliant for what he was doing. He did something called the Cultural Revolution, where he had young people go out to villages and claim that it was local Confucian leaders who had caused all this failure. They were put on trial and they were executed. And he used that to create scapegoats so that he would be protected in his office. Well, by the time we get out to the late 1960s, China is almost a failed country. So that's basically China and Russia. But what about the other areas of the world, places like Africa, Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba? In these areas, we also see communist revolutions, but the communist revolutions there were really based upon the inequalities created by imperialism and inequalities between America, Europe, and the developing world, things that had been done during imperialism, including social Darwinism. There, people reacted against these problems. For example, in Vietnam, French imperialism was reacted against by a nationalist Vietnamese movement led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. In Korea, there was anger over the Soviet Union and the United States. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States split up Korea into North Korea and South Korea. And North Korea basically saw the West as imperialist. In Africa, numerous countries rose up in rebellion surrounding around communism because of imperialism that had taken place in the century beforehand. Okay, so what are our takeaways from all of this? First major takeaway that I want you to see is that communism didn't go down the road it was supposed to. It wasn't a revolution of workers in Western Europe. It was a revolution of farmers in places like Russia and China and the developing world. The second big thing that I want you to get out of this is how communism was different in different places. So while in Europe and in Russia, communism ended up becoming these sort of like global superpowers in a fight, in the developing world, it was often about the reaction against imperialism. The last is the reaction of the world to communism itself. How did the United States and Europe react to this? They reacted to it through something called domino theory. The idea of domino theory, like when you play dominoes, is that you knock over one domino, it spreads out and knocks over the rest of them, right? That was the idea that the United States and Europe would develop. They believed that in any place, if communism was to knock over one domino, it would knock over all the other countries in communism as well. It actually didn't work out quite that way. The communist countries were not so connected as the West was going to think. And we'll get into that when we talk about the Cold War.